Hello and welcome to ChatGCP, a medical science clinical research and commercialization podcast, and I'm your host, Charles Beasley. While it is well understood that clinical research plays a crucial role in the advancement of medical knowledge and developing new therapies, we need to also recognize that it contributes to the reduction of health inequities by providing access to next-generation interventions before they hit the market. In an era where public health budgets are tightly constrained and the cost of modern technologies is ever increasing, clinical trials needs to be viewed as a vital component of the wider healthcare system. Here to unpack this topic and more is today's guest, Dr. Ed Watson, the CEO of Aotearoa Clinical Trials.
So, Dr. Watson, great to have you on ChatGCP today. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
So, you are the CEO of Aotearoa Clinical Trials Trust, a private, non-profit clinical research entity based in Middlemore Hospital, or connected with Middlemore Hospital. But obviously, we are in a phase of growth now and branching out into additional hospitals. We'll get to that in due course, but I wondered if you could take us through the personal history that you have with the clinical trials research industry, and how you got kind of started in this area of work.
Sure. Well, my background is I'm a medical physician, and back in the 2000s, a long time ago now, I was working for a big multinational company called Pfizer. I was working offshore, and unfortunately I developed a melanoma on my neck, which was kind of predictable, being my colouring, and I'd actually seen a dermatologist every year for the preceding 3 years. But unfortunately, on a trip back from New York, I noticed a lump in my just next to my jaw, and I went in to see a ENT surgeon who told me that it was melanoma. It obviously spread from the primary, which was probably on my neck, and now I was in the lymph glands just beneath my right jaw. I then proceeded to have surgery to my neck and have the lymph glands out, and then received radiotherapy after that. This was 2003, 20 years ago. Following that, everything went according to plan. I got discharged, went back to work, and a few months later I noticed a black mark on my left forearm and also felt one on my back. And I went back to see my surgeon, who gave me the bad news that unfortunately melanoma had now spread throughout my body. They did a PET CT and found that I had it in my lungs, in my liver, in my spine, in my ribs, and in both hips. And so he kindly, I would say on reflection, indicated to me that I probably had 4 to 5 months to live. I should do what I really wanted to do with my life, travel, and then probably I wouldn't see Christmas. So this was sort of May, June of 2004.
Gosh.
And so it does sharpen the mind being given a sentence like that, especially a terminal illness. And quickly I resigned my job and moved my family back from where we're currently living in Sydney, Australia, back to New Zealand, so that I could set them up. I declined all current therapy because I knew that it would not save me. It would probably just make me sicker for the period of time that I had left. And I embarked on trying to find a clinical trial somewhere in the world. Luckily, through my connections, both in Australia and in the US, I managed to get on to a novel therapy out of the US at UCLA in Los Angeles for the first of a class of new drugs that everyone was experimenting with and very excited about. These were called immunotherapeutic drugs, which until that space, all treatment of things like melanoma had been done with chemotherapeutics. The difference being chemotherapeutics are basically poisons that you're given until you cannot tolerate the side effects, whereas immunotherapy is supposed to enhance your own immune system, which indeed failed in the first instance, so hence why you got cancer. So luckily I got involved in a clinical trial out of UCLA for one of the most novel therapies at the time, and luckily I survived it. After a few doses of that, the melanoma just melted away, and after 3 years on the clinical trial, I had no more discernible melanoma in my body. So a miracle, no two ways about it. Obviously, there's a bit more to it than just that, but in a nutshell, that's what happened.
Yeah. So that's, I mean, an incredible story. You were very fortunate to get onto that. Was it a very early phase study, phase 1?
Yeah, it was a phase 1B, 2A study out of UCLA with a drug called tremelimumab, which is a CTLA inhibitor. Basically, it sends your immune system into overdrive. Mm-hmm. Yes, I got quite a lot of side effects from it, but they were tolerable in the end. And indeed, I lived to see my children grow up and do some pretty cool things. So it was certainly a great outcome, but I think it burnt that fire in me that clinical trials was something that I wanted to make more available to New Zealand and New Zealanders because of the fact that we have limited access to novel chemical entities in this country, and certainly through clinical trials is a way you can get there.
Absolutely. I mean, how did you get access to that phase 1 study? So you mentioned it was in UCLA in Los Angeles. So did you uproot your entire family to go over to do that study?
No, it's like a lot of things in life, it's luck. And in this instance, I was randomized, as you are in a clinical trial. I was randomized to the top dose, which was once every 3 months. Big dose, but once every 3 months. So the dose escalation part of the clinical trial was either you received a smaller dose more often, monthly, which would have meant that I had to live in Los Angeles.
Yep.
But luckily, I got randomized to the dose that was every 3 months, so I didn't have to live in Los Angeles. But you still had to turn up. So my first appointment lasted 40 minutes with the oncologist, and I flew 12 hours to get that appointment. The agreement was that whenever they requested I turn up, I'd turn up. So I was fortunate, one, that I had the wherewithal to be able to get there when required. Two, that the side effects were manageable and I could get on a plane and get out of there before they got too bad. And three, I had a very impressive oncologist who was prepared to take the risk. Not something that they would do lightly, but obviously he believed that I would follow his instructions, and he believed it was worth a shot.
So really, in terms of access to that clinical trial, it was simply the money you had to put up to get the flights and the accommodation.
Correct.
And without having that money for the flights and accommodation, there was no way that you would have otherwise been able to do the study.
That's true. That's true. But these days, I think it's slightly changed. I think UCLA would probably ask for a bond these days because the side effects of drugs do often end you up in hospital, and no insurer will pay for you to fly to America and go on a clinical trial. So it's under your own auspices, your own ability to do it.
Yeah.
So it is a big risk. I don't think there's any doubt about it. But when you're faced with not a lot of hope, then the fact that they were prepared to take me meant that as long as I could get out of there before I got too sick, it was probably worth a shot.
Yeah. And at that point, there was nothing available to you that could have treated the melanoma.
No, standard of care meant that I got, with beta interferon, meant that I probably had 12 months of feeling like I had the flu every day, and then the probability would be that I'd die after that. So they didn't seem particularly good odds, or indeed something I wanted to embark on, so I politely declined. Yeah, well, amazing. So incredibly fortunate that you got the opportunity to do the trial. Lucky that you were also on the high dose, the large interval between doses. A lot of luck involved, but thank goodness, very fortunate outcome for yourself, for your family. And now you're, I mean, as you mentioned, you've got a huge fire for bringing clinical trials to New Zealand. I think it's very easy to look at clinical trials as a means to an end. You know, we're trying to develop a new product, that product will go on and then treat individuals with a disease or a condition. And it's easy to overlook the impact that it can have on the individual participants in the clinical trial. It's something that we, overlook, but highly important. I mean, your life changed dramatically, the course of your life and your family's life, and now you are heavily involved in clinical research. So did that start with your current posting with Minimal Clinical Trials, or did it happen earlier than then? No, I started being very interested in clinical trials when I left clinical medicine and then worked initially for the industry for a company called Pharmacia. It was a pretty progressive company. I was in charge of the clinical trial program for New Zealand, and I got to learn pretty quickly the impact of what clinical trials could bring to a community and indeed to the medical profession. When you're working with companies, when Pharmacia got bought by Pfizer was then the biggest company in the world. And so the resources that these companies have, I mean, it's a risky business. 500,000 molecules that they discover, only one of them will get to become a certified drug that's regulated by the FDA or approved by the FDA for use in humans. So there's a huge amount of money spent trying to get these drugs to market. But that wasn't really my interest. My interest lay in the fact that you could see people who didn't have a lot of hope or indeed options, and clinical trials gave them that option. They gave them another option. Mightn't necessarily have worked out to be anything. As distinct from cancer trials, most clinical trials have a placebo arm, so it's entirely possible that you could receive a sugar tablet. That said, that there's very good evidence to suggest that the very fact that you're on a clinical trial will improve your outcome, regardless of what you receive in terms of the dosage of the product or indeed whether you receive placebo.
Yeah, because you're having regular interactions with healthcare providers, with the healthcare system. And regular maybe, what's the word I'm looking for? Intervention for things that could be going wrong in the background because you're having that regular contact.
Agreed, but I think it's also that what we find with participants on a clinical trial is they learn a lot more about their disease. They feel that people are significantly interested in them, and time is no longer the issue. And often you find in a health system that is cash-strapped and indeed limited by time because everyone is very, very busy, being on a clinical trial is often a freedom to a participant. They seem to have a lot of time to be able to discuss their specific condition. They seem to have also time to understand how things could or would make them better, and indeed what they can do. The empowerment of a clinical trial is, I've experienced myself, but in the same instance, it's very important for people who've often tried a lot of other therapies, have usually been unwell for quite a long time, and here is what they actually need, which is access to highly trained health professionals. It's also a lot of information that helps them understand their disease and what they personally can do to make their life better. And that's a very powerful combination. It's definitely not just the drug alone.
Yeah, and it's also the access to the information that is potentially cutting edge.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, a lot of what we do have access in the healthcare system that's funded might be fairly low-tech is probably like a bit of a cynical way of looking at it, but these are, grandfathered in kind of technologies that are run-of-the-mill. They're cheap, they're efficient, they're effective enough on a large-scale basis, whereas in a clinical trial setting, chances are it is more cutting edge. It's the technology that is on the cusp of development today, for tomorrow's treatment, being available today, right?
Exactly. It's years in advance. The participants receive it if they do receive the active drug. It's years in advance of when it would be potentially funded, or even available, let alone being funded. And so, from that perspective, they do get a jump. And also, the important aspect of that is that the doctors also get early experience, and with that type of molecule, indeed that type of class of drug. And so a rule of thumb is that if you do get sick, then going to specialists who do clinical trials is a good thing, because of the fact they know technology and they know the standard of care as it is now, but they also know what the future looks like in terms of treatment options, and that's hugely helpful.
Yeah. So that really does illustrate the benefit to the individual on top of, obviously, society's benefit, but in the future. And it really does show that clinical trials are a useful tool to pick up maybe the slack in what's currently available or people have current access to. I mean, can be used as a measure, as a way of reducing health inequities, right? I mean, if you have access to something that could improve your health, it could put you on a level playing field with someone that might not need that access because they're already healthy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I recently came back from a conference in the US where I heard the commissioner for the FDA speak, and he said America suffered from financial toxicity with regards to their access of pharmaceuticals in America, i.e. if you don't have insurance, you don't get access to drugs. Well, I think in New Zealand we probably suffer a bit from access toxicity, which we just do not get access to new chemical entities that comparative OECD countries do, including Australia. And often, unfortunately, the only way you can get access to some of these new drugs is through clinical trials. Whether that's correct in terms of whether that should be that way, it's a bit of a moot point. I speak to investigators who wish they didn't have to provide access to drug as the reason why they were doing clinical trials. They'd rather look at the scientific merit, et cetera, et cetera. But I think reality is in a country like New Zealand, access to novel chemical entities is often the first time you'll get it is through a clinical trial, or the fastest way you'll get it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few unique aspects to New Zealand, right? I mean, I saw an infographic the other day that I think in the last 10 years, 10% of new chemical entities have been approved or funded. I forget which it is. I think it's funded.
It'll be funded, yeah.
Which is compared to 80% in some other countries in the OECD, which is incredibly low. For me, what kind of is a bit sobering what's very sobering is that if you play that out another couple of decades, the gap is just is compounding, right? So it's 10% and then another 10% and then another 10% every decade. So by 2050, we're talking 1%.
It's scary stuff.
0.1%. So, yeah. So the work that you do at Middlemore Clinical Trials, well now Aotearoa Clinical Trials Trust is really one of the main core directives is to make up for some of the slack in the system, right? And then
absolutely, yeah. I mean, my staff, we have around about 55 staff, all highly trained professionals, health professionals, whose job is to bring clinical trials to New Zealand and make the management of clinical trials safe for patients primarily, but also to produce the high quality data that's required by the sponsors of the clinical trials. And the reason they get up in the morning is to do exactly as you described, to try and reduce health inequity, which we see in a hospital like Middlemore, indeed our partnering hospital in Whangarei. We see that again, where there is quite a lot of health inequity, especially in the areas of high-tech medicines, cancer and malignant hematology especially.
Right. So what's the background of Middlemore Clinical Trials Trust? I'm going to use that interchangeably, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
I just absolute reflex.
It sticks in your head. Yeah. So that was formed in 2001, Middlemore Clinical Trials. It actually started as CC Rep Centre. I'll get this wrong, so I won't even try to say what it used to be. But Middlemore at the time was interested in clinical trials, but like all big service hospitals, clinical trials can be a cost to the hospital itself. Right. And so to create an independent trust meant that the financial and indeed the legal risk moved to the trust. And that allowed freedom to operate for the trust, which indeed it's done over its 21-year history, and to employ people and to actually resource as required. The beauty of a trust structure is that there are no shareholders. Clinical trials are quite fashionable as a place for people to plant their money in terms of private equity, but in a trust structure as we've got, any money that we are fortunate to make from running a large clinical trial then gets ploughed back in departments that we work with so that they can do more clinical trials. And clinical trials in a hospital setting are not just sponsor-driven big pharma trials. They're also investigator-led trials, and a really interesting part is collaborative group trials, where a group of interested physicians get together from around the world and they design a clinical trial that will help answer a specific question. How much salt do you need in a diet? Or indeed, if we add these two drugs together, is that better than the standard of care now? There is no desire to make money from that. In the grant trials, it's desire to answer a scientific question.
Yeah, so there's two potential avenues there. What is, in terms of the net benefit, is there any bias towards the investigator-initiated trials versus the commercially sponsored trials? I mean, I imagine the pool of money that can be gained by the trust and then put back into the health system or the hospital would be greater from the commercial sponsored trials, correct?
Yeah, correct. I mean, some of the grant trials do well, especially if they're funded by the NIH in the States and everything else. But in reality, both trials are about providing access and also showing whether the trial has scientific merit. That's always what we're trying to do. I think from that perspective, New Zealand really undershoots in terms of the amount of commercial clinical trials, those ones which are industry funded, compared to comparative countries too. It seems that we not only don't have access to good funded medicines, we also don't have access to all the clinical trials that other countries get. And that is something that we are trying to address as a collective New Zealand Inc. approach, together with the government. New Zealand is a very good place to do clinical trials. We have an excellent health system, even though there is a lot of discussion about its merits at the moment. It is still a very good health system relative to other countries. It has extremely well-trained staff. The health professionals in this country are some of the best, the best trained staff in the world. And so on the basis of that, we should do very well attracting clinical trials to New Zealand. There's a few things that don't seem to work in our favour. One is the tax incentives that other countries like Australia put up, and two is the tyranny of distance. We are a little bit further, less well known, and also don't quite have the track record or indeed the key opinion leaders that some of the other countries have, which attract some of the sponsors as well. But we're working hard to try and address that.
Yeah. It probably depends on who you talk to, but I think New Zealand is often overlooked on the globe, let alone, a globe specific to clinical trials.
Agreed.
And some people might say, oh, you're from New Zealand, so is that part of Australia?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. So, unfortunately for us, we can't act on our own. We do have to act in concert with bigger countries. We have to act in concert with Australia, where a lot of the sponsors base their staff. And indeed, we have to convince them not only to deal with their sites in Australia, but to open up some more sites in New Zealand. And that's a risk to them and it's a cost to them. So we do have to perform.
Yeah.
The fundamental thing that we probably have over most of those countries is speed. We have an excellent ethics system, which is very fast, transparent, and very professional. It is world-class. And so when you combine all those things, it's actually quite an attractive place to come. We're certainly not the cheapest place on earth to do clinical trials because our professionals expect to be paid well, and they are paid reasonably well. It's a good career for a lot of people. It's stimulating, and indeed we attract very bright people. I have a lot of PhDs and MScs, excuse me, and research nurses who are all very clever people, often top in their field. So to combine all that is a heady mixture that New Zealand can do, and it's great that we can keep them in the country.
Is the argument for bringing trials to New Zealand, and specifically Aotearoa Clinical Trials Trust, is that built into, is it a necessity to bring on partner hospitals so you have a larger footprint? You can say we've got a bigger potential population from which we can recruit. Does that add into the argument, or is this just a logical extension of a model that's working clearly quite well at Middlemore Hospital?
I think it's a bit of both, actually. I think that New Zealand, no sponsor wants to come to a country and have one site. So we have to work with our partnering sites, and hence our strategy to actually partner with more public hospitals. We're the largest public hospital-based clinical trial research unit, and so it makes sense to want to partner with other hospitals and bring that on. And I think working in a hospital in a clinical trial unit is far different from working in a private clinical trial unit, which is out in the community. It means that we have a lot more departments we can work with, a lot more specialists, but it also means that we have to make sure that the hospital can still do what it does, still provide service to its patients, and that we don't cost money to the system by us being there. And our model proves that that doesn't have to be the case. In fact, we can add very much to the overall offering that the hospital does, both in terms of attracting doctors back to New Zealand, because a lot of doctors overseas want to work in hospitals that do research. They just don't want to do service alone. But also, importantly, it offers another option to the patients in the community. Apart from just standard of care, they can get access to specialists quicker than they otherwise would through the usual referral patterns, but also a huge motivator for a lot of our participants is to try and give back. Very altruistic. They're very interested in the next generation. They know that the medicines they are on is a result of people volunteering to be on clinical trials. And that is probably the biggest motivator for them to be part of it. But without a robust clinical trial system and a network throughout New Zealand, then the inequity still exists. So we are passionate and driven to ensure that we spread throughout Aotearoa, New Zealand, and offer clinical trials to everyone regardless of where they're located.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like it's building enough critical mass around additional capability. So I think the expertise and the doctors that are interested in that cutting-edge research, they want to stay on top of beyond standard of care, beyond services, attracting people to stay in New Zealand. We often hear a lot about brain drain, and obviously we've got that partnership now with Australia, which makes it even easier for the brain to be drained, which is, I'm not sure if that's a great thing. So it makes sense to replicate it. I mean, we've got 11, 14 public hospitals in New Zealand.
Well, probably more than that, 26 probably.
Oh,
So we have a lot of hospitals here with a lot of ability, but it's very hard to set up a clinical trial unit. You have to obviously make sure that the standards by which you do it, your labs, your pharmacy, everything else is of a certain standard. And also it's different from what's offered in the hospital per se to start off with. So it's very hard for smaller hospitals to replicate all that, and we're aware of that. But there are some exciting innovations happening. Decentralised clinical trials, very much a catch cry around the world at the moment, and that's where you have a centralised site and you deliver clinical trials to the peripheral centres, which are not actually having to be equipped like a normal site. And this could be in the shape of a van which is well equipped with all the equipment you need, including the centrifuges, the -80 freezers, the ability to take blood and store blood, as well as look after the intellectual property of the compound that you're actually going to use, the investigational product, and that has to be stored at a certain temperature, etc., etc. So that's possible to deliver that, and we're working with companies both in the US and the UK who potentially can help us partner with that, because again, one of the things, it's not particularly helpful to New Zealand to only have clinical trials in the main centres. Yeah. It's also important that we can get those clinical trials to people in the regions, because they're just as needy as anyone else, and it's often a huge barrier for them to access care by having to come into the big centres.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if the core ethos of Minimal Clinical Trials Trust, Aotearoa Clinical Trials Trust, is to combat some of the health inequities, it doesn't really make sense to just service the main centres and then it's kind of adding to it. It's reducing it locally around the main centre, but it's just adding to the current inequity, which we know is, I mean, do we know, is it growing? I mean, you get the prevailing notion that the access to novel medications is decreasing.
We certainly see that in the clinical trial space. If you don't offer a clinical trial, then people don't tend to go too far to try and get that clinical trial. I went to Los Angeles, but then again, I could afford to. So I think one of the more important things about it all is to make sure you have a system that is relatively consistent in what it offers. Again, for the sponsors, they don't want to come somewhere and have to have different ways of working with different sites. And that's what we're trying to provide, is a centralised, standardised way of working, so that their ability to offer us trials, we know the doctors and the departments to contact. We make the system as fast as possible because New Zealand has to maintain its speed. If we lose our speed, there is very little reason why pharma companies would want to come and do their sponsored clinical trials in this country.
Right, and that was actually a hot topic around the new therapeutic products bill, right? Updating the system so it's more, well, it is modernised, because I think a lot of the regulations were baked in the 90s. We've come a long way since there, but changing things to be more modern, but without affecting the timelines that we have in New Zealand, which, as you mentioned, are pretty fast.
They are fast, but increasingly, to one of your points you made earlier, the gap between what we can offer here, our patients, and what's offered in leading countries like the US is growing faster. Right. You look at some of the precision medicine and the genomic-based clinical trials now, while some of our universities can offer that genomic testing, you certainly need to be able to upscale your ability to deliver the clinical trials to attract those trials to New Zealand. And we're at that point where when you look at some of these therapeutics, especially some of the immunotherapeutics or even CAR T-cell therapeutics, I mean, you're talking 400 to 500,000 US per treatment. And that treatment might be 1, it might be 4, but the cost is out of most New Zealanders' price range. They'd have to sell their house just to be able to afford the treatment. And that's something that, as a country, we really do not want to go down that road, even though we've potentially started doing it. And so, again, because of the fact there is no cost for the participant to enter a clinical trial apart from getting there, potentially clinical trials offer access to this novel technology, which is hugely expensive. But the problem being that if we don't invest in the abilities to deliver those clinical trials, then again we'll be left behind.
Yeah, I think a really obvious illustration of this whole thing that you're talking about is the Malaghan Institute and all the other companies that have been built around them to provide CAR T-cell therapies to New Zealand. I mean, without that infrastructure being built, without Malaghan having a lot of funding, private funding, to do the research to make it available, CAR T-cell therapy, which we know works very well in a proportion of patients that it does work well in. If it works well, it's going to work. If it works, it's going to work really well.
Yeah.
But without that full infrastructure, that just wouldn't be here. Right?
Agreed. But you see, when you've got haematologists who've never experienced or trialled patients on CAR T-cell therapy, it's very hard for them to contemplate even offering it to a patient. And so this is where the clinical trials ecosystem can really help, because if they've trialled in any sense a CAR T-cell program because of the fact the infrastructure has been built, then they're more comfortable at referring patients to other providers of CAR T-cell therapy, be they in Wellington, be they in Auckland, be they overseas, because they're well aware of when it can be used and the dangers of doing so. And I think when they're not involved in it, then it becomes an even greater and even bigger distance to cover.
Yeah.
And so it becomes less mainstream, whereas in a lot of advanced economies it's now mainstream. CAR T-cell therapy is becoming mainstream. And worrying in that is that they're even moving past that. So they're moving to CAR NK therapy,
right,
and they're moving into CAR T-cell plus immunotherapy.
Yeah.
Now, we're still struggling to get good access to immunotherapy in the country. So,
which is what you were on clinical trial 20 years ago.
Exactly.
So
20 years ago, I was on probably one of the early trials of any immunotherapy treatment. So I was indeed very, very lucky. A year earlier, I wouldn't have made it.
Yeah. Is there an argument to be made that this is compounding? So we talked about access to, New Zealand only funding 10% of new chemical entities from the last 10 years. Eventually, those will end up being standard of care in a lot of, first world countries. I imagine in the US, a lot of these things that we don't have here, they're available there, commonplace, provided you have the insurance to cover it. But it's compounding, so CAR T goes to CAR NK, CAR T plus immunotherapy. It's not as though things stay. So if we don't have access to a standard of care, then we won't get the next generation of trials coming here, right? So
That's
it is
right.
compounding. Yeah.
It is compounding, and it's accelerating. And so in the end, New Zealand has some tough decisions to make. To me, the cheapest and the easiest decision is to make sure that we have enough time given to our specialists so they can actually do clinical trials, which in a big public hospital like Middlemore is very difficult. We often have a lot of interested physicians, but they are time poor. Right. And so being able to give them ring-fence time to be able to do some of these clinical trials would help immensely. But secondly, we have to be brave in terms of upskilling and from a lab perspective, having the labs available that are technologically advanced enough so that we can do some of these therapies. Because when we look at CAR T-cell, one of the big things apart from experience of clinicians is the fact we don't have the labs that are accredited, that the sponsors from places like America or indeed China or even Europe would be prepared to do the clinical trials in New Zealand because we don't have the accreditation required. Malaghan's a bit different. They don't require the accreditation because they are New Zealand formed. And so their journey has been slightly different from that. But they don't have the same requirements as some of these big sponsors. The exciting part about it is the fact that some of these therapies, as they advance in America, are becoming more point-of-care therapies. So that means that eventually you're going to get a equivalent of a big box that's sent around the place that's standardized, and you can receive your therapies via this box. It's about like one of those vending machines you see around hospitals. It's obviously a bit more sophisticated than that, but the technology is there to be able to do that. Yep. And then New Zealand potentially may be able to catch up with that in terms of treatment, but how long that will take and what that gap will be and how many people will not be able to access therapy until then is very difficult to tell, but I suspect it's going to take a while.
Yeah. What do you think is the main block for us improving the situation in New Zealand? Is it throwing money at it? Is it encouraging more doctors to go into the profession or stay in New Zealand? Is it brain drain? Is it making international sponsors more aware of New Zealand? Or is it a culmination of all these different aspects?
It's a combination, I suspect. It's a combination of all these things. The difference you note in countries like America and Australia is that the politicians seem to get the value of a robust clinical trial system. When I was in Australia, the Prime Minister would stand up and say, we need more clinical trials in this country. We need a robust clinical trial system because of and he understood all the benefits. We don't tend to hear that from our politicians in New Zealand. They like the idea of a blockbuster being created here, but they have to understand that it's a pretty complex area to get into, and indeed it takes a long time for the skill levels to get to the point where you can effectively take a molecule out of a university and convert it into a clinical trial. So I think that would certainly help. I think also, as I said earlier, ring-fence time for interested research physicians in hospitals would also be very helpful. And also I think looking at the labs and the ability to do some of the required testing here would be hugely helpful. So it's a combination, as you rightly point out, but it's possible. It's certainly not out of reach of New Zealand. New Zealand has to have a bit of an aspirational plan towards it and believe in the benefits. And I think fundamentally until we have a government that does believe in the benefits of clinical research, we will struggle.
Yeah. I mean, not to get political, but in the last couple of weeks there was, I think one of the parties did announce that they would put more money into a specific cancer therapy if elected.
Yes, a few more than one, but I think that that's a good sign. I think, like anything, we're not asking for every single thing that America has, but I think we pride ourselves that we would want to be able to give our children and our parents and our friends access to the same standard of care as they'd get in Australia. And part of that is funded new chemical entities, absolutely. MedSafe per se here, which is the government regulatory body, is extremely good at making drugs available in terms of access, but it does not fund them. So that is a different organisation called Pharmac's responsibility. And so clinical trials definitely is part of the solution. The more clinical trials we have available, the less people have to wait until a drug is funded.
So that provides a really nice overview of the importance of clinical trials, the current status in New Zealand in comparison to maybe our friends across the Tasman and then further afield, the US. What are some of the highlights of what has been happening at Middlemore Clinical Trials in the last few years? So you appointed CEO in 2018?
2018, I arrived there. I set up the early phase, I helped set up the early phase cancer research unit at Auckland Hospital, which is a phase one, obviously dear to my heart. In partnership with the University of Auckland, which was terribly exciting to be able to have that in New Zealand, and worked with some really clever oncologists there who are absolutely committed to this. And then I moved to Middlemore Hospital, and we run all the clinical trials for all departments within the hospital, which is a relatively unique model for New Zealand. The beauty of it is that it creates scale and consistency. And when you get to sort of the size we are, you can invest in quality managers and quality systems. You can invest in the ability to make all clinical trials electronic, which we've done.
Wow.
And what that does is mean that you even increase your quality beyond that, because people can't now progress through the clinical trial until they actually fill out the correct data, because the system won't let them. It also allows for remote access. So what we were talking about earlier with satellite sites, which we've set up with some providers in South Auckland, means that we can look at their data, or we can look at how they're doing with regards to their patients from afar, and also allows the physicians to also do that, so they don't necessarily, with paper-based, they'd have to sign them off by hand, but now they can sign them off electronically regardless of where they are. So it makes it a much more efficient system. And so that's a huge highlight. I think also what's been interesting is the evolution of the staff. The universities produce some excellent staff, and a clinical trial program is about a project. And so if you've got people with PhDs and MScs, they have inbuilt project management skills. And they're bright and they're motivated and they enjoy the science. So to be able to offer graduates of that degree an alternative pathway from academia is a wonderful thing to be able to offer them, and something that we're all very proud of, being able to do that. We attract an immense amount of talented people, and as we said earlier, we keep them in the country because they're stimulated by what they do.
Yeah, I mean, that rings true for me, because I completed a BSc and then I thought, oh gosh, there's not much that I can do with this. I'll just do a couple more years at university and rack up even more student loan debt. And I was fortunate enough to find a stimulating science-based role that really made good use of my skills.
Yes.
But that is actually a challenge. I mean, if we're training up a lot of very bright, talented individuals through our university system and there's nowhere for them to go, the return on that investment, if you're thinking at high level, not great.
No, you're right. And I think one of the great stories about clinical trials is it's actually an export sport. It's actually an export earner. All the sponsors, 95%, 99% probably, are offshore. Yep. And so they pay us to do clinical trials in this country. Yep. And we employ New Zealanders to do that. So it's a great story from that perspective. It could be a huge export earner for New Zealand if it was mandated that every single hospital had to have clinical trial units. Not that I'm saying this would happen, but if that did happen, then I think we would get to the level where at least we're on par with Australia.
Yeah.
We don't currently get a fifth of what they get in terms of the numbers of clinical trials, and that's certainly something we're aiming for.
Yeah, and that fifth, that's our population comparison? Yeah.
Fifth, yeah. We're about fifth the size of Australia, so we should attract.
Per capita, we're behind.
We are per capita behind. We are in terms of attracting clinical trials to this country.
Yeah. Super interesting. And what happened with Middlemore clinical trials during the pandemic? That would have been a very interesting time period.
It was. It was still called Middlemore Clinical Trials back then. And it was a very interesting time because the sponsors, the Americans especially, closed the door in terms of new clinical trials, which is understandable. They had things to worry about back home. So the pipeline did tend to take a bit of a hit. The thing that, again, we were proud of was the fact that we sat around the table and we worked out that we could not shut the door to patients who needed to come in because of the fact that no one knew what drugs they were on. We were the only ones who understood some of these new chemical entities, so we made sure that we provided access. So we thought it was unethical to keep recruiting patients because of the fact we'd bring them into an environment which was COVID positive. But the patients who were already on clinical trials absolutely needed access, and so we made it as safe as we could, wearing the appropriate gear, ensuring that the access to the clinical trial unit was very focused so they didn't wander through the hospital to get there. And interesting enough, probably between 95 and 96% of our participants turned up. Wow. So they were immensely grateful. We seemed to be one of the few health centres that was offering any care. And the great thing about a clinical trial is you get access to a physician, so they need to know everything about your medical condition, which includes all the associated medical conditions. So in other words, they were getting access to that, which they were immensely grateful to us for doing that. And again, for us, it seemed to be absolutely worthwhile to do, and indeed was.
And when has the door opened up since the COVID has kind of subsided?
Yeah.
And the pandemic restrictions have gone away more or less?
Absolute huge wave of people and sponsors wanting to do more clinical trials. We have to be cognizant of the fact that these sponsors can do the clinical trial anywhere in the world. But when you work in somewhere like Counties Manukau and you see the rate of diabetes in the community, and you know some of the technologies that are out there, you become quite desperate to get some of these companies to come. And indeed, we've got people over in Australia now for that very reason, to try and get some of these companies to come back to New Zealand who had left for a variety of reasons. And we need them back because the technologies that they have will make a huge difference to the communities that we work in.
Yeah. Is there any specific trial that it rings out to you as being just wow, this really solidifies why we're doing what we're doing?
Yeah, I think some of the, it's interesting. You see so many of it, but the visual effects of seeing a patient who has a dyslipidemia, which is they have too much fat in their blood, and an American company. We were the first in the world to actually recruit to this trial, so it was really interesting. But to see that these people who had heart attacks in their early 20s because their fat in their blood was so great that they would predispose them to cardiac arrest and heart attacks.
Wow.
And so most of them had some degree of heart disease by the time we saw them. And their cholesterol and the associated lipids was extremely dysfunctional. And after one dose of one of the drugs that we were trialling, it all reverted to normal, and that maintained with no more treatment for up to a year.
Amazing.
And so their life expectancy in terms of future events was obviously a lot better. But also you see that in some of the novel therapeutics that are used in metabolic syndrome, diabetes, hypertension, and lipid problems. Some of the companies out there are now combining some of these drugs together. They're cutting-edge therapies. So, in the example of a very fashionable area at the moment, which is obesity, some of these combinations are reducing obesity by, on average, in a participant by 22%. Now, when you realize, when you know that obesity surgery, bariatric surgery, reduces obesity or lean body mass by 29%, you're not too far away from it with no surgery.
Yep.
And so those things are very exciting, especially when you see the obesity pandemic that is affecting New Zealand.
Is that the semaglutide and related compounds? Or
it's GLP-1s and GIP-1s and the glucagon agonists. They're able to combine a lot of them together. And I can't remember whether it's an agonist or antagonist, actually, tell you off the top of my head. But I think the combination of them means that what you see now is the ability to treat diseases that we wouldn't have been able to treat years ago, or the only treatment was surgery.
Yeah. And on a cost to benefit ratio, surgery is highly invasive. You need a lot of additional support around it for not just the immediate post-operative period, but for a period afterwards, which is quite expensive, versus a clinical trial where these drugs are presumably subcutaneous administration, and away you go, and you end up with broadly
same outcome. Agreed. But we have in this country a disease of trying to ring-fence certain spends. And so what tends to happen is we don't want to spend the money on a pharmaceutical, but at the same time we're happy to pay for the outcomes of not being treated, which is my excess toxicity I referred to earlier. So we get toxicities from not, talk about toxicities from taking medications. You also got toxicities from not taking medications. And so the excess toxicity is that. So we look at the degree of renal failure or kidney failure in this country. It's huge. And a lot of that is due to diabetes, of which we have extremely high rates. And I'm not saying that it's all due to access, but a lot of it is due to lack of access to modern therapeutics and indeed clinical trials.
Yeah, we would like, in a perfect world, it would be great to say we have a program where we can prevent any such development of diabetes, type 2 diabetes or obesity. But the reality is that it's here, it's likely here to stay, or at least in some state or form. We need to have the best armamentarium to combat things like this. Like
Agreed, but you see, I think it's slightly worse than that. You're talking about diabetes, but all these patients are going on to lose their limbs and have renal failure and kidney failure and poor quality of life. So we're poor at stopping them progress. And I think that's a subtle difference. And these modern therapies, to a degree, will help us stop that. So to me, the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff is all the renal dialysis units that we have to have in this country, because of the fact that we seem to struggle with paying for therapies before they actually progress, which seems a bit
I mean, I had a discussion with Abbas Al-Marani. He's a health economist. He runs Health Economics Consulting New Zealand a couple of weeks ago. He was on the podcast, and he talked about the different types of analyses that you can do to, you know, cost versus cost-benefit analysis, cost effectiveness, cost utility. Obviously, the gold standard one is the cost utility, because you can compare different interventions. You don't have to compare two interventions in the same arena.
Sure.
You can compare, you know, combating diabetes with some kind of program versus cancer, and how useful is it? How much value does it provide? And, you know, you get so excited. This makes a lot of sense, where we should spend our money, where we should invest. And then you hear that there are 11 health economists in the country of 5 million. And you go, that's not a lot of people crunching the numbers to figure out where our money is best spent. So without that kind of input, what you alluded to is that it goes into buckets of spend. You said you ring fence the spend. It's like, we're doing a program, we've got $10 million for this program. What is the most effective thing within this fence? We're not comparing this paddock with this paddock, though we should be, because we don't have the tools to compare them and see what actually is worth our money.
Yeah, and I think possibly one of the mistakes New Zealand's made is ring fencing pharmaceutical spend without reference to downstream effects. And you know, I'm not here to talk about that, but the fact of the matter is that certainly meant that you have quite a few drug-naive patients, which means that they've never been on standard of care, which would be considered standard of care in other countries, which again poses both a problem to us because of the fact that often they have to have jumped through a few hoops or been on standard of care in America before they can progress to the clinical trial that we want to run. But at the same time, it means that for novel therapies, if these patients have not had any treatment, then again, they make it quite interesting for sponsors to look at these patients and say, well, they haven't received what we'd consider standard of care in America, so let's see how they go on this new type of drug. Right. So not that it's something that I think we should be proud of, it's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah. So something that would otherwise have been second, third or fourth line end up being first line via clinical trial, no less.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not a particularly good situation, but the fact is it's the reality of what we deal with and makes us more hungry to bring many more of these clinical trials to New Zealand so that access is available to patients in a multitudinal number of diseases, not just the ones we've talked about, but every single one. You know, we do surgical trials, we do vaccines against viruses and bacteria that are prevalent in the communities that we work in, and they make a big difference. We don't do healthy volunteer trials for that very reason, that we don't really see them as much benefit to the communities that we serve, because there's nothing really wrong with the patient, they're healthy, and they're coming in to see whether the drug has any side effects. So we deal mainly in those conditions that we see in our community that need to be treated, and indeed for one reason or another, it's poor access to medications, or indeed the state in which the patients are in, they require access to pretty novel therapies.
Yeah. So what's your hope for the next 5-10 years of the wider ecosystem in New Zealand for clinical trials and for Middlemore Clinical Aotearoa Clinical Trials Trust in particular?
Well, I think in the name, I mean, for our perspective, we're very keen to create a national clinical trial network. Right. That means that regardless of where you live in New Zealand, you can have access to clinical trials. And that's not as simple as it sounds, but at the same time, when you have the ability to run trials efficiently, and there is a benefit to the community with which you do it, and also there is a feedback loop from a financial perspective so that people can run even more clinical trials, then we're really keen that evolves throughout New Zealand. And I think once we get to a size of a network that is of a certain size, then it gains attention abroad. If we had a hospital network of even half a dozen hospitals, that would probably put us on par with Australia in terms of attractiveness, because we'd have something they didn't have, which is a fast, streamlined, efficient and consistent clinical trial process that meant that a sponsor could just ring us up and they'd get 6 sites straight away. Yeah. And that would be hugely exciting to be able to do that, because we know we would be competitive. When I talk to my colleagues, again, I obviously have colleagues at UCLA and other places in the US. And when I talk to them about a network of clinical trial sites, they become very interested in that because it actually means that New Zealand could box above its weight in terms of population size. It also answers and helps to address the inequity perspective, so therefore these clinical trials are more available throughout the country. And so, that's a really exciting thing that we're trying to embark on. Not easy, especially in a system, in a healthcare system that's changed dramatically in a year. And the distractions of what that does to the people that we work with.
Right.
And so, it's a slow burn, I think, but we're pretty empowered to do something about it.
Yeah.
We'll just have to see how we go.
No, it's very exciting. I'm thoroughly impressed with the work that gets done at Middlemore Clinical Trials, now Aotearoa Clinical Trials Trust. I did have the good fortune to work as a CRA with Middlemore many moons ago before I moved into a project management career.
Yeah.
But it was always a good reminder of how important clinical trials are, not just for the company developing the drug, but for the individual being involved in it, and also the wider community supporting the clinical trial. And no more does that ring true than with Middlemore Clinical Trials and Aotearoa Clinical Trials Trust. So if people want to learn more about yourself and ACTT, where can they go?
So we have a website, aotearoatrials.nz, and obviously we like to speak to people and love to hear from people who are involved or interested in clinical trials. We're also always looking out for new talented people who want to be involved. We're looking for people in Whangarei as we speak, actually. And I think also with participants, they have a lot of questions, which is great. We run a pretty open ship. We've got nothing to hide. I think some of the theorists would think, or some of the people out there who are interested in vaccinations may think differently. But from our perspective, we're very interested in trying to make access to clinical trials part of the paradigm of treatment for New Zealanders.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Watson. Been an absolute pleasure.
Thank
All
you.
the best.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, and thanks for having me.